April 22, 1945. In the heart of Berlin, as Soviet shells pound the city, Adolf Hitler, once the absolute ruler of Europe, suffers a violent mental breakdown in his bunker. His hands tremble uncontrollably. 30 feet below ground, a desperate leader clings to routine and gulps 28 different medications each day. But his regime is collapsing as quickly as his health. This is the beginning of the final 24 hours of Adolf Hitler. How does a dictator face total downfall in real time? And what secrets did his last day truly hold? Gunfire rattled through the streets above as Hitler's commanders gathered in the dim bunker conference room. The city he once ruled was now a battlefield. Soviet troops had breached Berlin's outskirts on April 16th. By April 22nd, their artillery thundered so close that the walls trembled. The radio crackled with fragments of desperate reports. No relief was coming. The much-vaunted Steiner counterattack had collapsed before it began. The last reserves were either destroyed or cut off. Hitler demanded answers. His generals, Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, stood silent, unable to offer hope. For 3 hours, the meeting dragged on as he demanded explanations. Then, the breaking point. Hitler's voice rose to a shriek. He accused his staff of betrayal, failure, and cowardice, pounding the table, his words echoing in the cramped chamber. Witnesses later described him as hysterical, denouncing his commanders for universal treason, corruption, lies, and failures. He shouted, "It is all over. The war is lost." Joseph Goebbels scribbled in his diary that day, noting the collapse of morale and the sense of finality that swept through the room. Staff members stood frozen, stunned by the outburst. The reality outside the bunker had finally forced its way in. Hitler's refusal to leave Berlin was no longer bravado. It was resignation. He announced his intention to stay in the city and die at his post, regardless of the outcome. The bunker, once the nerve center of a continent-spanning regime, had become a tomb. Above ground, the Red Army pressed closer with each passing hour, their gunfire a constant reminder that there would be no escape. Inside, the man who once commanded millions now raged at ghosts and shadows, his authority crumbling as surely as the city around him. The decision to remain sealed the fate of everyone in the bunker. The final chapter had begun. In the bunker's stale air, Hitler drifted through the corridors like an apparition. Traudl Junge, his secretary, later described him as like a ghost. He didn't seem to see anyone. His skin had turned a sickly yellow, eyes sunk deep into shadowed sockets. Gone was the forceful figure of old newsreels. Now he shuffled, hunched, his gaze fixed on some distant point no one else could see. The transformation was more than exhaustion. Dr. Theodore Morell's medical diaries detail a daily regimen that defies belief. Up to 28 different medications, administered in a relentless cycle of pills, injections, and drops. Cocaine was dripped into his right eye to dull the pain and clear his vision, while barbiturates, opiates, and hormone injections coursed through his veins. Methamphetamine tablets fought his fatigue, even as sedatives and painkillers blurred his senses. Flatulence pills, vitamin concoctions, and mysterious animal extracts filled the gaps between doses. His right hand trembled constantly, a symptom he tried desperately to hide. During his final public appearance, he clasped one hand tightly behind his back, hoping to mask the shaking. Staff noticed the effort it took for him to stand upright, his movements slow and uncertain. Heinz Linge, his valet, recalled the rigid routines that persisted out of habit. Timed dressing games, the daily presentation of spectacles and newspapers, rituals that seemed to hold reality at bay for a few more minutes each morning. Eyewitnesses agreed. The man in the bunker bore little resemblance to the dictator who once commanded a continent. His body had become a catalog of decline, ravaged by disease, racked by medication, and hollowed out by defeat. In those final days, Hitler's physical collapse was as unmistakable as the collapse of his regime, each symptom a visible measure of the end drawing near. Late in the evening of April 27th, the bunker's last thread to the outside world carried a shock that shattered what little unity remained. The BBC broadcast a bulletin. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and once Hitler's most trusted enforcer, had begun secret surrender talks with the Western Allies. The news, relayed through static and foreign voices, struck like a blow. Hitler's reaction was immediate and ferocious. He erupted in a rage that dwarfed his earlier outbursts, screaming accusations of betrayal and treason. The man who had orchestrated terror across Europe was now, in his final hours, betrayed by his own inner circle. He ordered Himmler's arrest on the spot, branding him a traitor. The command was clear: no mercy, no forgiveness. Himmler's name was stripped from every official record in the bunker. Even his SS liaison, Hermann Fegelein, was seized after being caught in civilian clothes trying to escape. Fegelein was dragged before a summary court-martial and executed in the garden above the bunker. This act of treachery followed on the heels of another. Just days earlier, Hitler had learned that Hermann Göring, his designated successor, had sent a telegram from southern Germany, suggesting he take over leadership. Göring, too, was denounced and cut off. The regime's highest ranks were now consumed by suspicion and fear, each man watching his back as the walls closed in. Trust, once the foundation of Hitler's authority, had collapsed. The bunker was no longer a command post, it was a prison of paranoia. On April 28, 1945, a chilling report pierced the gloom of the bunker. Italian radio and newspapers blared headlines from Milan. Benito Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, had been executed by partisans. Their bodies were dumped in the city's Piazzale Loreto, spat on by crowds, then strung upside down from meat hooks at a gas station. The images, quickly relayed to Berlin, sent a shockwave through Hitler's shrinking circle. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, watched as the news landed. The Führer's reaction was swift and deeply personal. Turning to Linge, he spoke with a rare urgency. "You must never allow my corpse to fall into the hands of the Russians. They would make a spectacle in Moscow out of my body." The humiliation of Mussolini, his ally and, for years, a fellow dictator, became an obsession. Hitler saw his own fate reflected in the Italians' end. Not just defeat, but public desecration, a final act of vengeance by the victors. From that moment, Hitler's instructions grew more precise. He demanded that no matter what happened, his body must be destroyed immediately after death. This was not bravado, but fear. Fear of being paraded through enemy streets, of his corpse used as a trophy. Linge later recalled the gravity of that order, knowing it would shape the final acts in the bunker. As Soviet artillery thundered ever closer, the fate of Mussolini's body haunted every decision, casting a long shadow over Hitler's last hours. Midnight struck in the bunker as a small group gathered in the map room, the muffled roar of artillery pressing in from above. In the heart of devastation, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun stood side by side before a low-ranking city official. The civil ceremony lasted only minutes. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann signed as witnesses, their faces drawn and pale under flickering lights. Eva wore a dark blue silk dress, her composure steady. When the register was placed before her, she began to sign Eva B. Then, in a deliberate gesture, crossed out the initial and wrote Eva Hitler. For the first time, she claimed the name she would hold for less than 2 days. There was no music, no flowers, no celebration. The wedding breakfast that followed was a muted affair, champagne and a few hurried toasts, the atmosphere heavy with dread. Goebbels offered a speech, his words forced, as if trying to conjure normalcy from the ashes. Outside, the Red Army's guns shook the ground. Inside, the couple's union felt both intimate and unreal, a final act of defiance or denial as the world collapsed around them. Eva smiled, leaning close to Hitler, determined to share his fate. The brief ceremony, witnessed by men who knew they would not survive the coming day, anchored the emotional reality of what was to come. two lives joined in the shadow of annihilation. At 4 in the morning, Hitler summoned Traudl Junge to the bunker's small study. The air was heavy with exhaustion and cigarette smoke, but his tone was deliberate, almost ceremonial. He began dictating his final political testament, every word measured, each phrase echoing the language of denial and accusation. "The responsibility of the outbreak of this war cannot rest on me," he insisted, shifting blame to what he called international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or worked in the Jewish interest. The document named new leaders for the crumbling Reich: Karl Dönitz as president, Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. Himmler and Göring were denounced as traitors, their names struck from the record. Goebbels stood nearby, silent and watchful, while Junge's fingers raced across the typewriter keys. The testament closed with a final, unyielding order. His body was to be burned immediately after death, ensuring it would never become a Soviet trophy. When the dictation ended, 4 witnesses stepped forward: Goebbels, Martin Bormann, General Wilhelm Burgdorf, and General Hans Krebs, each signing their names below the text. Within a day, all 4 would be dead. Copies of the testament were prepared for delivery, entrusted to couriers who would try to escape the city's ruins. In those early hours, as the world above collapsed, the bunker's last legal act was sealed by signatures and silence. On April 29, 1945, news filtered into the bunker from the Western Front. American troops had liberated the Dachau concentration camp outside Munich. Reports described an overpowering smell of death and scenes of horror that stunned even battle-hardened soldiers. The first U.S. units to enter, members of the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions, found thousands of corpses, emaciated survivors, and evidence of mass murder on an industrial scale. Shock and revulsion swept through the ranks. In the chaos, some American soldiers turned their fury on the SS guards. Eyewitness accounts and post-war investigations would later estimate that between 50 and 520 German captives were killed in reprisal. The official U.S. Army report, filed after the fact, concluded that, in light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops, fixing individual responsibility would not serve justice or equity. This news, reaching the Führer bunker as the city above burned, landed with chilling force. The stories of retribution and the images of liberated camps fueled a conviction among bunker residents. Surrender was not an option. To those trapped below Berlin, the world outside seemed to offer only vengeance. The knowledge of what awaited, should they fall into enemy hands, hardened the fatal resolve that now shaped every decision. Death, not capture, became the only imaginable escape. April 30th began with routines that seemed almost ceremonial beneath the weight of collapse. At exactly 11 a.m., August Vollenhaupt prepared his tools and trimmed Hitler's mustache, just as he had on countless mornings before. Heinz Linge, the ever-faithful valet, kept up their daily ritual. A stopwatch in hand, he called out, "On your marks," as Hitler dressed, racing against the seconds, then handing over spectacles and the morning newspaper. These gestures, stripped of any real purpose, offered a thin shield against the chaos above. In the background, SS guards fed stacks of documents into makeshift fires, the flames consuming years of secrets as Soviet shells rattled the concrete overhead. The illusion of order held for only so long. Hitler summoned his doctor and ordered that his beloved Alsatian, Blondie, be poisoned to test the cyanide capsules. Eva Braun's spaniel was also killed, following his instructions. The bunker filled with the sharp scent of burning paper and the unspoken understanding that these were the last acts of control left to him. By early afternoon, the bunker's atmosphere grew heavier as the end drew near. Hitler began a slow circuit of farewells, offering a silent handshake to each member of his dwindling staff. The gesture was brief, no speeches, no outward display, but the meaning was unmistakable. Eyes met for a moment, then dropped away. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, the secretaries, the aides, each received the same wordless acknowledgement. For many, this was the first and last time Hitler looked them directly in the eye. Eva Braun moved quietly among the women, her composure fragile but unwavering. She declined all offers to escape, repeating, "I would rather die here. I do not want to escape." As she embraced Traudl Junge, she pressed a fur coat into her hands. "Take my fur coat as a memory. I always like well-dressed women," she said with a faint smile. Cyanide capsules were distributed, a final gesture of control in a world reduced to choices between death and surrender. The air in the bunker thickened with resignation. Each farewell was a private reckoning, the last traces of hope replaced by a calm acceptance of what was to come. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the bunker fell silent as Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private study. Minutes later, a single gunshot shattered the hush. Heinz Linge and Otto Guenche entered to find Hitler slumped on the sofa, a pistol in his hand, Eva beside him. Cyanide and a bullet had ended their lives. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and the others moved quickly, following Hitler's explicit instructions. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up the narrow staircase to the Chancellery garden. Soviet shells landed close by, shaking the earth as the group hurried across the rubble-strewn yard. 200 liters of petrol, hoarded for this moment despite Berlin's crippling shortages, were poured over the corpses. Linge struck a match and flames leapt up, consuming the remains as Goebbels and Bormann stood by, arm raised in salute. The fire raged in the open air, even as the city's destruction thundered around them. In the aftermath, the world was left to reckon with the ruins. As one British observer later reflected, the end of Hitler did not bring the simple victory of good over evil. Too much cruelty remained, and too many wounds were still open. In the final 24 hours, Adolf Hitler relied on 28 medications, dictated his last will at 4 a.m. on April 29th, and by 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, his death was announced as Soviet artillery shook Berlin above. Eyewitness accounts and documents confirm the physical and psychological unraveling inside the bunker, from his trembling hands to the burning of his remains under Goebbels' orders. Yet, key questions remain. Soviet files on the recovery and identification of Hitler's body were kept secret for decades, and some details of his final moments are still debated among historians. The collapse of Nazi leadership, shown by betrayals and desperate rituals, underscores how power can disintegrate when faced with moral and military defeat. Today, the archival record, testaments, diaries, and forensic reports, stands as evidence of both the devastation wrought and the critical importance of confronting unchecked authority. The final 24 hours of Hitler are fully documented, but their lessons are still being examined,